Welcome to Face to Face. This is a show about change and what's next. It's a show that asks questions and peels back the layers of our average everyday experience and goes beyond scratching the surface. We interview people doing incredible things who are making a difference around the globe. Join me as we listen in and get one step closer to understanding that big ideas shared create collaboration. Collaboration can inspire community, and communities create social change. I'm David Peck, and this is Face to Face. So I stumbled onto Villon Films. Sounds like or looks like Villon Films when it's read sort of without the accent. But Peter Davis, founder of Villon Films, he's been independently producing and distributing movies since 1970. And you've got to check Villon Films out via Villon Films.ca. Check them out online. Peter's a guy who's coming to the end of his career, but he's still got a lot of passion and intention and desire to make movies. He's been directing and producing and writing for many, many years. He's got an archive of over 250 films on his website, produced and directed about 70 all in. And we're talking about issues stuff: CBC, CTV, BBC, CBS, NBC. The list goes on. You may have not heard of Peter before, but you should have. Check out some of his work online and listen in carefully, because we talk about an awful lot here in this interview, and we talk about interpretation and about truth and about the power of storytelling. I think you're going to enjoy this interview. Don't forget to check out davidpecklive.com for more interviews. Check us out also on rabble.ca, and stay tuned for, if you're a filmmaker, if you're a storyteller, stay tuned. Well, welcome to Face to Face. We're joined by a filmmaker today, a man by the name of Peter Davis. Peter, thank you for joining us today.
Oh, pleasure to be here.
Yeah, you are the founder of Villon Films. Tell me about Villon. You've been around a long time, and it's Villon, spelled Villon, villonfilms.ca. Definitely check them out online. Tell me about that.
All right, that name came about through, I did a lot of work with Barry Callahan. Do you know that name?
I don't, no.
Oh, Barry is I think, is he Canada's national poet? Anyway, he's a poet and professor, and he worked for CBC one time, and we did some work together. And since we set up a company at that time, it was really only the two of us.
Okay.
We wanted a name, so Barry suggested Villon, actually Villon, François Villon, which is named after a famous French poet.
Okay.
So saw no reason to get rid of the name, kept the name.
Oh, okay. And do you find most people like myself mispronounce it?
Yes.
That's funny.
In North America.
In North America, there you go.
North America, west of Ontario.
So when I read your sort of your bio about Villon Films, and you're located out west, you're in Vancouver, you've been working on award-winning films since 1970. You've got a vast library. What do you sort of put your success up to? I mean, this is quite the library of film you've got.
Well, success, I'm not sure if that's the right word. How do you measure success? If you measure it by income, then it's not very spectacular.
Right.
But in terms of doing things that I wanted to do, up until, let's say, the 90s, it did work. In those days, I always used to think that, okay, this is documentary filmmaking. It can't get any worse, and it did. It got worse. Year by year, it got worse until kind of strangulation in the 90s. A revival in this century, of course.
Sure.
Documentary filmmaking, because of the ready accessibility of equipment, of cheap equipment.
Sure.
Cheap and good quality equipment. So, but now I'm at the point where I think I've always made films for myself primarily, please myself primarily. And now what I'm doing, and those I don't think any longer, because of style perhaps, because of the kind of things I do, they're no longer in demand. So what I'm trying to do essentially is finish up some unfinished projects before I die or before I become incapacitated in some other way. So that's what I'm working on right now.
So this is you're working on a project. You say you're going away tomorrow. You're working on a project that you started X amount of years ago, and you're just kind of bringing those loose ends together. Is that sort of what you're referring to?
Yes, I've got 3 or 4 projects similar to that, unfinished projects, which now I can do. In those days, of course, you had to raise the money.
Right.
You had to get film, pay for film, which is enormously expensive. I shot a number. I started a film in 1981 on the Spanish Civil War. I couldn't get any money for it at that time, and now I'm finishing it just in time for the 80th anniversary of the commencement of the Spanish Civil War, and almost 40 years after I started.
Right.
But that too is near completion. So.
Oh, fantastic. So Peter, do you as a filmmaker, do you make the distinction between a good film, a distinction between, say, a great film versus an important film, or would you kind of call them the same thing? I mean, I look at your page here, and I believe it says 255 films that you've worked on, curated, directed, written, produced, etc.
Well, it could well be more than that. 70 I've directed.
Okay.
70 plus, I suppose. But I've also worked as cameraman, editor on a number of others.
I would imagine. So do you make that distinction? I mean, I look at what you've been about for the past X amount of years, and I think important. I think social justice. I think politics. I think extreme poverty. I think issues that need to be talked about, not just in the classroom.
Yeah. Well, social problems have, I think, been in the forefront. Search for social justice, I think, which is ever elusive.
Is ever elusive.
Yes.
Indeed.
I mean, the films that I've made, I would not say they're great films, but they have been useful films. I'm thinking of my apartheid series.
Mm-hmm.
And I had the wonderful experience some years ago. I was in South Africa, and I met a man. He was driving me somewhere, this was in Cape Province. He was driving me somewhere for a meeting, and we'd never really spoken before, and we started chatting, and he asked me what I did. I said, I make films, and he asked me what films I made, and I mentioned Generations of Resistance as one of them, which was about the indigenous anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, and he said, we use that all the time. I mean, when he was a student in South Africa, in apartheid South Africa, that film was one of the films that they used, and that I think was the supreme point of my career.
That's got to be pretty incredible. So did you say this was a cab driver?
I'm sorry?
Who was the person that you had bumped into?
Well, he was actually an academic.
Oh, he was an academic. Oh, okay, I'm sorry.
He had been a student.
I see. Okay, yeah.
And no, I mean, he's actually not an academic high standing, but that's neither here nor there. But as I said, it was not a great film, but it was a useful film, I think.
Right. So you said earlier that you made these films for yourself. What do you mean by that? Especially in light of this story.
I mean, I think in order to be, I don't consider myself a great filmmaker. I've made some very good films, I think, but I'm not a great filmmaker. And I think to be a great filmmaker, you have to be obsessive, and I'm not obsessive. Okay, if I can't get a subject going, then I will go on to another one that I can get going. Okay, but I know of filmmakers who produce wonderful films, but it's taken them 10 years in the making, and they really have to be terribly dogged about it.
Sure.
But for me, there's so many things that interest me that I can, not necessarily willingly, but be prepared to go on to another film if something doesn't work out. But at the same time, I don't like to leave things unfinished. So that, as I say, the things that I never did finish, I'm trying to finish now.
So do you refer to yourself as a storyteller in conversation? Is that how you?
Sure.
Yeah.
Oh yes, first and foremost, I think.
So tell me about that, because I've just come off the Toronto International Film Festival. I approached them this year. I was fortunate enough over the past few years to get the odd interview here and there with the filmmaker, couple of actors along the way, I suppose, a couple producers as well, television and film. And then this year I went after media accreditation, which I got to my surprise. I ended up interviewing about 21 different filmmakers, most of them documentarians. And a question that I like to ask about this whole idea of story is, because I think, as a philosopher, I think that story kind of points to truth. And I'm not always that interested in whether or not the story is actually true. Does that make any sense?
Well, of course it does. But I mean, what is truth? You're left with that question, aren't you?
Indeed.
What constitutes truth? There is no such thing as a universal truth, is there? There's no such thing as something that satisfies everyone as being true. So what I do is my interpretation, not necessarily of a truth, but of something I find of interest. I'm not sure if that's satisfactory. It certainly doesn't satisfy me when I'm saying it. So let's talk about this for a second. It's your interpretation of these particular events, like apartheid, yes, for instance, as they unfold, or as you edit? They unfold before my camera, of course.
Yes.
Which, as you know, is itself an interpretation of a reality. It's not the reality. It's not a universal reality. It's just what I choose to select when I point my camera. And then how I shoot. Right.
Yeah. So in a sense, everything you do is kind of an editorial choice of a particular.
Yes, but that was certainly much more the case when we were shooting 16mm film. Because I was thinking, okay, this 10-minute reel of film costs $500.
Right.
Okay. I therefore have to edit as I'm shooting.
Right.
And that is the huge difference between the way we worked in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and the way people work today.
And was that primarily cost, essentially?
Was it what?
Just cost?
Oh, sure.
Just
absolutely.
Incredibly expensive, therefore we can't afford to waste it.
Of course, yes.
Huh.
And you may have to make judgments as you're going along, and sometimes those judgments are wrong. Okay, you switch off the camera because you think nothing's going to happen and something's happening. You're not on. Okay, so that was the situation. On the other hand, what can happen now is you get enormous amount of footage, and the process of editing must be therefore that much harder.
Yeah.
But, I mean, when you started shooting a film, you really had to have a concrete idea of what it's going to look like when you're finished.
Right.
And that's not necessarily the case now.
Did you start out as a sort of a classical journalist working for a news agency?
No. I started. Well, my first job was as a teacher after I started working part-time in a hospital, trundling things around in a hospital. My job was as a teacher.
Okay.
So I taught for a couple of years, and then I started in the lowest possible level of filmmaking in Britain at that time.
That strikes me as kind of funny.
Which was an apprentice assistant editor. Okay?
Apprentice?
You could not go lower than that.
Hang on. You were an apprentice assistant editor.
You weren't even an assistant, but you were learning to be an assistant.
Oh, that's very funny, actually.
Yes.
I can imagine the paycheck wasn't that great.
I'm sorry?
I can imagine the paycheck wasn't that great, Peter.
Well, let me think now. I think it was only £7 a week.
£7 a week.
Yes. Which was maybe enough to get by on in those days, but not very much further than that. One thing I'm going to digress to.
Yeah, please.
Because I think it is important, and that is I have a fairly substantial amount of completed films. I also have an archive which is lodged at the moment at Indiana University of outtakes. Are you familiar with that term?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. So that's the material that did not go into the film.
Sure.
And that over the years has in a sense been my lifesaver, because as you get older, as the material gets older, it becomes historically more important.
Sure.
And the material that you didn't put into a project can now be just as important as what you did put in. Okay. So the stuff I shot on the anti-war movement in the United States in the late 60s and early 70s, that is to a large degree my bread and butter now. Things like that, you know. And that's stock footage. I sell that stock footage. Stock footage sells for about $40 a second. Yes, $40 a second, depending on who you're selling it to. And you can imagine you can make a few good sales that way.
Yeah. So you're probably wishing that you'd spent more of those $500 reels now today.
Well, I couldn't, because it wasn't. You know, there was a budget.
Yeah, of course.
Came from somewhere else. And you could not spend more than that, unless it came out of your own pocket. You could not spend more than that amount. So, I mean, we always shot as much as we were supposed to, or maybe a little bit extra, but not too much extra.
So you're the apprentice assistant editor. Are you thinking at that point that you're going to go on to make these 70 films?
No, at that point, I think I felt I was going to be a scriptwriter.
Oh, okay.
And whatever happened, I'm really glad that I did not do that. I mean, of course, I write documentary scripts all the time, but this was fiction
right.
films. I'm glad I did not go into fiction films. The few times I've been on a feature film team have been among the most boring in my life. You spend a lot of time doing nothing, okay, and that doesn't suit me at all.
A lot of hurry up and wait.
Yes. I mean, the larger the crew is, the more spare time you have. So I couldn't stand that. So I'm glad I never did that. I'm glad I never became a scriptwriter, because I don't think I would have been a very good scriptwriter. Fiction, anyway.
So, I mean, is that a place to start for filmmakers today? You know, you mentioned
apprentices.
Yeah,
I get.
Or let's say the lowest rung of the ladder. Is that the place you should? I'm an apprentice. I'm an electrician. I did 8,500 hours as a.
By no means. I mean, you know, I give lectures at university, and students sometimes say to me, "Well, how should we get into film?"
Yeah.
Well, study law. You know.
Interesting.
Why should you start at the bottom when you can start at the top?
Right.
You know. So, I mean, lawyers run the business now. Of course, they're not creators, other than creators of money and.
Right.
But that's all important. Yeah.
Does it disappoint you a little bit? Would you say, you know, having been in this business for so many years, that it seems to be more of a business today? It's about maybe not documentary filmmaking so much, but just the big business that it's become. You know, somebody texted me a note the other day and said they spent $46 million wrecking cars in the new James Bond film.
Yeah. Yeah.
How absurd is that? What could a documentarian do with $46 million?
Yeah. Well, let me see. What can I say there? I mean, you know, what's important for me is that. Well, okay. In the old days, let's say, I could go to CBC with an idea.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I may not even have to write it down. I just say, "Look, this is the idea," and they would say, "Go." I'm talking about doing something for Weekend, for example. If you remember Weekend days, I don't know if you're.
I don't know.
Okay, you're too young for that.
That's right.
Okay, you could go to Weekend, which is exactly what it was, a weekend program of short documentaries. And give them an idea, and they would say yes on the strength of what you had done before, right?
Right, sure.
And you could do it. I mean, the budget would be limited. You would not make a huge amount of money, but you could certainly do it. Nowadays, you know, try to do that.
Yeah,
I mean, it's absolutely impossible. Absolutely impossible. They have this thing now which they call the pitch.
Right.
You may have heard that term.
Yes.
and I absolutely hate that. I would never submit myself to a pitch, because what happens there is you're really a salesperson. What you're selling is yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, yourself attached to an idea.
Mm-hmm.
But the glib sales talk is what counts for those people who are listening to the pitch. Whereas I think it should be the record of the filmmaker.
Right. Okay. So do you largely self-fund your films? Is that essentially how you've been able to
at this point, there's no alternative.
There's no alternative.
At my age, no one's going to fund me.
Even with the history of the films that you've made?
No. No one knows the history of the films I've made. Everyone I talk to now is 50 years my junior.
Right.
So they would never know my film.
Well, I guess in some ways that is an upside, I suppose, to the filmmaking world, the sense that anyone can take a camera and document something. And so we have newsreel footage that we wouldn't have. We have instant access to violent events around the world and so on and so on. But I guess with, every opportunity comes liabilities as well. Mm-hmm. Do you think it's a good day for young filmmakers?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if they're not out to make money, I would say it's a good day.
Right.
If they're out to make a film or to do something, then it's a great time.
Yeah. So this is a big question, and I think earlier before we turned the recorder on, you referred to it as, some of the questions that I had sent you as being metaphysical, but I'm kind of interested on your take on human nature a little bit, working in development. Getting on the ground. My sort of preferred country of focus is Cambodia. I'm kind of in love with Southeast Asia on a whole lot of levels, but my wife and I have spent time there together. She's taught in Singapore, etc. And so, you've been documenting human nature, it seems to me, or maybe you've been documenting reactions, of humans to their environment and to things that are going on around. What do you take away from that, Peter? I mean, shouldn't you be writing a book?
Well, I actually am.
Oh, good. Oh, excellent.
It's called Outtakes.
Outtakes. Very nice. I love it.
And it's about it's a story surrounding particular things. I sent you a couple of. Did I send you more than one example?
I think you sent me one example. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I have maybe 4 or 5 of those. I'm now going to go back to 1967, and
I was
made a film in London then called Anatomy of Violence.
Okay.
And this was about something called the Dialectics of Liberation and the Demystification of Violence, which was organized by R.D. Laing, and there were Allen Ginsberg, Herbert Marcuse.
Marcuse, you're not going to believe me, but that's the name that popped to mind. One-Dimensional Man. It's one of my favorite books. Oh,
he's a great man. He was a great man. Stokely Carmichael and many like that. And I made this film called Anatomy of Violence. Okay. A few years ago, I was contacted by someone who wanted to develop a drama out of that material, which is fine by me. But this sort of gave me the idea of looking again at that material. I had all the outtakes for that, and since then, what I've been trying to do is track down people who attended. Okay, most of the prime speakers, I think maybe all of them. No, not all of them. Most of the prime speakers are now dead.
Okay.
But people who attended, I've done about a dozen interviews.
Oh wow!
And what I did was try to get their perspective on what came up at the dialectics at that time, and how the world has shaped itself. Because the issues then were the environment, they were racism, they were war.
Sure.
And those things are eternal.
Yeah, indeed.
And so, yes, this is a revisitation. And, from my own point of view, everything that came up then, every subject that came up then, is now in worse shape than it was then.
So in a sense, we haven't learned from the past then.
No, exactly. No, that's human nature. I mean, learn from the past. I mean, human nature is so stupid, basically, you know. It's so unable to see that cooperation is essential for the survival of the human race. But immediate issues like making extra dollars override that. And that, to me, is the most stupid thing that can happen. When I think of the situation of pollution, it seems to me that successful species end up dying in their own refuse, being drowned in their own refuse. And I think that's what's happening with humankind. I have no hope for humankind. I mean, if it lasts to the end of the century, in anything like a halfway decent situation, if I were around, I'd be surprised, but I'm not going to be around.
So do you think, Peter, that your sort of your harsh or your stark realism, or some probably would call it cynicism, I mean, did you lose your hope somewhere along the way, or would you say that as a filmmaker, as a documentarian, you've always sort of had this opportunity to peer into, you know, the dark side of human nature?
Well, no, I didn't. I'm a kind of optimist. I'm a social democrat, and it seems to me that's the best of all known possible systems anyway. And people have left that. They seem, certainly in North America, they don't regard that system seriously, and even in some ways consider it a threat.
Right.
But to me, it seems the most decent system of all.
Well, you mentioned, you know, so why is it so, or it's, you know, human beings are unable to see that cooperation is essential, you know.
Yes.
And I think my work as a development worker, as I teach in international development at Humber College here in Toronto, and it's the same thing. I've read a lot of the work of Emmanuel Levinas, and a French philosopher who, you know, says that the face speaks, and, you know, what it says is thou shalt not kill. And so this Jewish philosopher who lost his family to Auschwitz, who said, what we have to do is we have to recognize this humanness, this human being in somebody else's face, immediately presuppose the other, and then we can, you know, his opening line to his book, Totality and Infinity, is essentially, you know, all religion, all philosophies failed. Now what do we do? Right? We're completely screwed. Now how do we address this? How, in another way to say it, I guess, how do we cooperate?
Yeah.
It's really quite remarkable. So are you saying you don't see that as an end for us as a people?
Well, I mean, everywhere that people do on a small scale, they do cooperate, and they cooperate very successfully. But on national levels, it's very difficult. It seems very difficult. I mean, you know, I think capitalism is a killer system, I think, for the human race. But I don't. But it's so tremendously strong. I think sometimes about the 70s. I lived in the United States at that time, and in the 70s, okay, they stopped the anti-war movement. You can call it successful, and then the right wing got smart.
Right.
They bought up the media. And you know, I go to the airport, and I look at the books, the magazines available there, and there's nothing that's political anymore. Nothing.
So talk about that a second, Peter, because that really interests me. You sound like a professor of mine from years ago, quite the Marxist, Arnold Atwaru, who talked about this sort of, you know, what it looks like we're reading, you know, when you go to the bookstore, lots of books to buy, but look at what you're being offered. So are you sort of saying there's that presupposition of a right-wing form of censorship, or is that sort of where you're heading with that?
No, censorship. No, they were just certainly in television, you can see that they now monopolize ideas on television. You look at what happened at PBS, for example. Well, your perspective may not be as long as mine, but you could get things on PBS at one time that were critical of the United States. No, you can no longer do that. Okay, you cannot criticize the United States pretty much in any form whatsoever.
And Peter, isn't it true that some of those kind of sort of rules and regulations, they're never really written down,
no,
right?
No, they're not written down. No.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, I'll give you another example. I did a documentary on David Suzuki, okay? And at one point in the documentary, this was for CBC, okay? I showed the clear cut. And when we came to show this biography to the two CBC producers, they said, you can't show that. That's propaganda. I mean, the irony was that that footage had come from CBC.
Right.
Okay. But then I thought, okay, what these people are seeing is the threat to their jobs.
Right.
When the people who are buying advertising on CBC see something like that, okay, the reaction that comes about. So in a national broadcaster like CBC, having commercials is death. Absolutely.
Commercializing CBC is the death of CBC. Is that?
I'm sorry.
Sorry, what did you just say?
I said having commercials on CBC.
Oh, having commercials.
Yeah. It's deadly. I mean,
right, because you immediately we've got compromise.
Built-in censorship.
Built-in censorship, yeah, and I think, I mean, I have to agree with you. I mean, I think that stuff, that ideological sort of those inklings that well, they're not even inklings; they just become ways of life. You know, I'm not a determinist, so I'm not crazy about using the phrase "it's part of your DNA," but it almost becomes a part of who we are.
Yes.
To the decisions we make are driven by these what become just sort of bits and pieces of how we behave each and every day.
Yes.
Which is what's so dangerous about them, it seems to me.
Yes. Well, we don't live in a democracy anymore. We live in a capitalist society. I mean, I don't think you can have a capitalist democracy. I don't think so.
Right. So when you see, so I'm going to guess that you're not on Facebook.
Never. Absolutely never.
That you're not on Twitter or anything along those lines, and probably don't spend a great deal of time on the internet, maybe reading news and doing research and so on. Yeah. But do you think, Peter, does that make you hopeful in any sense? So this idea that, the ubiquity of it, I can go and make a movie and post it for anyone to see and so on.
Yeah. I'm impressed by, not simply because I have children and grandchildren,
right,
but I'm impressed in how smart the next generation after that is. These are super smart kids. I'm glad I'm not competing with them at university level.
Right, that's interesting. Very encouraging, very affirming. I love it.
At the same time, what they're up against is enormous. I mean, I think it's well, I wouldn't say it's a toss-up because I think the odds are so much against them. I don't think they will succeed. But I think they're good enough to try.
Right.
And to have some success. And another good thing is, I mean, both my sons-in-law work for a company called Stripe. It's a cyber company. I tried to get them to tell me what it does. Then sit down for 15 minutes and tell me, and I still don't know
what's going on. No. Yeah.
But apparently it's very highly thought of.
Right.
And, I mean, no, I was going to say something, but I can't say it openly.
Hey, we don't have commercials on our podcast here, Peter, so we can say whatever the hell we want.
I mean, this is something that was told to me in confidence. I can't believe.
Oh, I see. Okay, yeah. Don't betray your confidence with your family. That's not a good idea.
Yes. So I'm not quite sure where I was going with it.
Yeah, no, I just wonder if that sort of brings you a little bit of hope. The fact that
Oh yes, I know what I was going to say.
Yeah.
That their motivation, although they make extremely good salaries.
Right.
Okay. Their motivation is not primarily money. I would say. Okay.
You would
say
the
form of accomplishment. Yeah.
So you would say the youth of today are more interested in accomplishing something than making money?
Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
So, yeah. I mean, the best. Let's call them the best of them. Yeah.
So what was it? Let's go back. Believe it or not, we're coming sort of to the end of our time. But tell me about. So you're the apprentice editor. What was it that drew you in to say, I got to pick up a camera? And was it a story? Was it were you outraged about something that wasn't being told? No, I'm really interested. I mean, Peter, this is a life talk about a commitment here to telling stories. I think it's brilliant. I think it's wonderful. And I hope your book Outtakes sells wildly, flies off the shelves.
If I ever finish it, no, it's only been published as some articles so far. Anyway, going back, I had been an editor, and I went to Sweden, and I worked in Swedish Television. It was really in the early years of Swedish Television, and I worked as an editor there for a while. And then I thought I would like to make my own film, so I made a documentary. I made a series of documentaries for them. Many of them about England.
Okay.
At that time, and that was what started me. Yeah.
And was it the new technology that drew you in? Was it? Are you a storyteller by nature, sort of, or was it?
Yeah, I think.
I guess I'm just trying to get to that moment that almost like that aha moment. I mean, rarely are they aha moments. It's more of a process. Change takes time. Incremental change and so on. But
yeah.
No, I'm just maybe the Vietnam War. Oh, okay. Well, I'm going to grab a camera and I'm going to start documenting this anti-war movement.
Oh no, it's just like the apartheid. My apartheid series. It was an involvement in a particular issue. But involvement as observer and commentator. Okay. Not in the sense in the front line, although you did accidentally get it.
Sure.
Not accidentally, but you did have to put yourself in the front line.
Sometimes. Sure.
But I think it's I don't know. It's my way of interpreting humanity or humankind. In some ways, I think it's a substitute for living. I certainly know that when I'm as I am here now at home editing. Yes. I'm not engaging with other human beings.
Right.
Yeah.
You're not. Do you work digitally now?
I'm sorry?
Do you work digitally now?
Yes.
Yeah. Would be kind of foolish not to, wouldn't it?
Yes. Almost impossible not to.
Maybe it's a way to sort of kind of wrap it up here, Peter. But it's kind of interesting that here you are making all these films that other people are watching, that other people
or not watching, as the case may be. Yeah.
Or not watching, as the case may be. But I think there's room to be hopeful in the sense that you've created this incredible library and archive of footage that people can access. That I really do believe in incrementalism, Peter. The little things make a big difference. That these moments, that these stories, that these films could actually catapult somebody into a new field, into a new direction, into new academic work. Creating artworks of their own and so on. And so. Yeah. I guess I believe in the macro change, but I also believe in that micro sort of level as well. Yes. Working kind of from the ground up. But I find it kind of ironic that you mentioned that you thought filmmaking was kind of a way of not getting involved almost, and yet your films, when you look at your library, they're all about getting involved. That's pretty much what I would argue anyway.
Yeah, but again, it is a certain distance. So you do have to distance yourself somehow.
Yeah. Well, Peter Davis of Villon Films. I hope I pronounced it properly that time. Villon Films. It's Villon films.ca. You've got to check this library out. Peter, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciated your time and your effort. Good luck with the book. And yeah, it's been a pleasure talking to you today. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for giving me the time.